Now, I've been testing out the iPhone 16 Pro for the past couple of weeks, been really enjoying it. It's certainly one of the most capable smartphones that you can get right now. But for the past few years, I've actually been daily driving this old iPhone 12. And I think back in 2020, iPhone might have peaked at that point when this thing was introduced. It reintroduced the boxy squared off design, had an OLED display, as well as MagSafe integration. Now on paper, the iPhone 16 Pro should completely wipe the floor with the old iPhone 12. Not only is the internal capabilities at least 5 times more faster, but it has a 120 Hz refresh rate on the display, a 48 megapixel triple array of cameras at the back, in addition to having a larger internal battery. But the real question is it actually better from a day-to-day use perspective? So in this video, we're gonna actually compare my old $200 iPhone 12 to the $1,000 iPhone 16 Pro. We're gonna take a look at the overall design differences, performance, as well as cameras, and then we're gonna see what the battery life comparison is with this old iPhone that has 76% battery health compared to a brand new 16 Pro. So if you're interested, let's get into it. Okay, so the first thing I want to take a look at is the actual dimensions between these two. You can see that the iPhone 12 is slightly less tall than the 16 Pro, and it's also thinner and lighter than the 16 Pro, only measuring around 7.4 millimeters versus 8.3 millimeters, and weighing about 164 grams versus 199 grams on the 16 Pro. Now you can see that the 16 Pro does have a slightly larger display, 6.3 inches versus 6.1 inches, and it has much smaller bezels with a larger screen to body ratio. But in terms of the overall resolution, the pixel dot count is roughly around the same at 460 ppi. Now the screen is also laminated closer to the top surface of the display, so not only do you get better viewing angles, but the overall brightness and clarity of the newer generation display is a little bit crisper, but not by a significant margin. Probably the biggest difference has to be the 120 Hz refresh rate, which the iPhone 12 is only at 60 Hz. Funny thing is, the new generation iPhone 16 is still at 60 Hz. If you want the higher refresh rate, you have to get the Pro version of the iPhone. Lastly, the maximum brightness is also double of what the iPhone 12 is at 2000 nits at the high brightness setting versus 1200 nits maximum on the iPhone 12. However, in terms of the color dynamics and overall black levels, since both are using XDR OLED displays, they do an excellent job of displaying HDR content, and colors look very vibrant, realistic on both displays. In terms of the general viewing experience, I would say that they're quite similar. Now, in terms of the internal specifications, we're using the latest generation Apple A18 Pro chip. It's a 3nm processor with a hexa-core CPU and a 6-core GPU. In terms of the memory configuration, you get 8GB of RAM on all models. The iPhone 12 used a A14 Bionic 5nm processor. It's also a 6-core with 4 cores on the GPU side. And in terms of the memory configuration, since this is the base configuration, you only get 4GB of RAM. Now, if you take a look at our synthetic benchmark results with Geekbench, we're not actually getting double or triple the performance as you would expect from a processor that's at least 4 to 5 years newer. We're actually getting around 1.5 to 1.7 times the speed as the A14 Bionic on the new A18 Pro. And the same thing goes for the Antutu benchmark results, where we're getting around 1.49 times the performance of the iPhone 12. Now, for my day-to-day use, loading up different applications, multitasking, I think besides the 120 Hz versus 60 Hz factor, they both do a fairly similar job in terms of loading most social media applications, playing YouTube videos without a hitch, as well as gaming on both platforms is a fairly similar experience. Besides, the higher refresh rate, in terms of the actual load times and general usability on both the iPhone 12 and 16 Pro, I think for most users, even power users, are not going to notice a major difference. Now, one thing I do like about the new iPhone 16 Pro is the addition of more buttons, including the action button, which allows you to pull up different shortcuts using that one single command, as well as a dedicated camera button, which acts as both a button for the camera shutter, as well as a slider mechanism, which allows you to control different aspects of the camera app. alongside the USB-C integration, which not only charges faster at up to 25 watts, but is the universal standard of the industry, unlike the Lightning connection that is used by the iPhone 12. Furthermore, a nice thing that Apple's added to the newer generation iPhone is the satellite connectivity, which is great for emergencies or if you're going to an area that doesn't have the best cell service. Now let's move on and talk about the cameras. Now Apple obviously has introduced triple cameras on their Pro lineup of iPhones. We're obviously comparing a base model iPhone 12, which only has dual rear-facing cameras. Both are 12 megapixels on the wide and ultra-wide cameras. Now, obviously, we have a completely new array of rear-facing cameras on the 16 Pro. 48 megapixels on the main wide camera. You have a 12 megapixel 5 times optical telephoto camera, as well as a 48 megapixel ultra-wide camera. In terms of video capabilities, you can shoot HDR 4K at 120 frames per second versus the iPhone 12 is 4K 60 FPS. Now, with all that said, I want to do a side-by-side comparison between the two. First, we'll start with the stills. Now, if I were to pull up this shot over here and tell you which one is the iPhone 12 and which one is the 16 Pro without any labels, you'd have a hard time finding which one was which until you start to zoom in. Obviously, with the 48 megapixels versus 12 megapixels, you are going to have a lot more pixels and fine detail is going to be shown, but not through a huge extent. If you take a look at this shot zoomed in into the radiator of this F250 diesel, you could see that basically we do have more finer texture in the fins of the radiator, but not by a significant margin. We're looking at least 4 times the megapixel count on the newer generation iPhone, but I don't really see 4 times the detail. Furthermore, here's another interior shot using the wide-angle camera in the Model 3, and this is a good dynamic range test of both cameras, and as you can see, we can see very similar details in the shadow and highlights, and again, I don't think one looks better than the other, and in fact, because of the slightly smaller sensor on the iPhone 12, it does have a deeper depth of field where more things are in focus. That could be a good thing, that could be a bad thing depending upon what you're looking for. Now we're going to take a look at the video capabilities on both, and here's a clip in the exact same scenario. Now what you're looking at right now is the main wide-angle camera on the iPhone 16 Pro, shooting at 4K HDR 30 FPS. Here's the iPhone 12 main wide camera, shooting at the same resolution, 4K 30 FPS in HDR mode. As mentioned earlier, the iPhone 12 has a smaller sensor, so everything has a deeper depth of field, so more things in the foreground and background are in focus, versus the iPhone 16 Pro with that larger sensor and faster lens does prioritize the foreground, so great for portrait photography and similar to what a large sensor camera would do. But in terms of the overall dynamic range and everything like that, they're quite similar in terms of their color rendition. Obviously, it depends on what the meter is prioritizing. But one big thing that I notice on the iPhone 12 is because the anti-glare coating has kind of worn off over time, it does suffer from a lot of glare issues, especially if you have a source of light shining directly at the lens. You are going to find that flare issue to be quite prominent. This is an inherent flaw in all the iPhones. Even a brand new iPhone like the 16 Pro does have a decent amount of lens flare issues, but it only gets worse over time as the anti-glare coating gets worse. But overall, in terms of general quality and clarity, they're actually quite similar than they are different in terms of color rendition and overall sharpness. The overall quality level is quite on par with each other. I would say they're 95% very similar looking devices. In terms of the low light capabilities, because we have a larger sensor and better optics on the iPhone, you are going to see a little bit better overall low light information. So sharper details in low light as well as a brighter overall image, but not by a huge significant margin. I'm very impressed with the results I'm finding with the iPhone. This video is very, very usable, and both the stills and video in low light is great because it still has 12 megapixels, so those photo sites are still quite large, versus on the iPhone, it does a great job of managing to have large photo sites with a good amount of detail with its hybrid sensor of 48/12 megapixels. And generally speaking, if you were to pick one over the other. I would say that obviously the 16 Pro looks sharper with greater shadow and highlight detail retention, but generally speaking, again, quite similar results and a fairly passable looking video in these extreme low light scenarios on the iPhone 12. Now let's go over the battery performance differences between the two. In terms of the capacity itself, the 16 Pro has a 3582 milliamp hour battery versus the iPhone 12 has a 2815 milliamp hour battery. On top of the smaller battery size, our old iPhone 12 has degraded quite heavily. The health levels rated at only 76%. Now, on our battery life run test where we play a HD video with 50% brightness in airplane mode, we got a total runtime about 22 hours and 8 minutes on the iPhone 16 Pro versus we got about half that runtime on the iPhone 12 at 10 hours and 55 minutes. Now, to sum up everything we've talked about, I do want to mention two compelling reasons why I would consider upgrading from the iPhone 12. Firstly is obviously the battery life. We have a significantly degraded battery, and as you saw from the results, we got more than double the battery runtime on our video playback test on the newer iPhone 16 Pro. But even with that considered, on my day-to-day use perspective, I can easily get 12 to 18 hours of daily usage. And yes, I am charging the phone on a fairly frequent basis when it's on my desk, when I'm doing my work, it's on a wireless charging pad. And yes, when I'm traveling without any external power, it can be challenging, but I've made it manageable during my 3-year ownership of this older generation iPhone. Interestingly, I got this back in 2021 and it was used. It had 81% battery health. A year later, it went down to 76% and it's still at 76%. Now, I could easily go to Apple and get the battery replaced, but the cost of that will be more than the phone is worth. And since the battery life is manageable for me, I'm definitely not going to pursue that option. Now, the second reason is the 120 Hz refresh rate, which is a lot more compelling to me. If you used a 120 Hz refresh rate phone and went back to something that refreshes at 60 Hz, you can definitely notice the responsiveness and the snappiness of the 120 Hz is very, very noticeable and something hard to go back to. And the funny thing is, even on the latest generation iPhone 16, they're still refreshing at 60 Hz for whatever reason. Now, if I just wanted the 120 Hz, I don't have to go to the 16 Pro for that. The iPhone 13 Pro actually was the first iPhone to introduce that feature. Now, in terms of everything else from the internal capabilities as well as multitasking capabilities, I don't think you're going to notice any difference between the 16 Pro and the standard iPhone, even though we have many generations of processors newer. Unless you're running more than 50 apps at a time, I think you're not going to really notice a difference too much. And app load times and overall day-to-day usability is quite similar across the board. Furthermore, in terms of the display quality itself, besides the peak brightness level and refresh rate, it's actually very similar in terms of resolution, clarity, as well as color rendition to the newer generation iPhone. Lastly, one of the reasons why you get a Pro version of the iPhone is for the better cameras. But in the long run, I actually find that Apple hasn't made tremendous amount of progress from generation to generation. And I think most of the shots and videos that I'm getting with the iPhone 12 is more than adequate enough for my needs. And even if you're publishing through social media and everything like that, I don't think many people are going to notice. And for the most part, the camera's 95 to 97% identical. Now, Mobile Report for the past couple of years have been surveying the entire world, and they found out that the iPhone 11 is actually one of the most common iPhones/smartphones all around the world. Now, if you're coming from an iPhone 11, I think it's definitely worth it to kind of upgrade because you are missing some core features that the modern iPhones have, like the OLED display, as well as the squared off design. But for most people that have iPhone 12 or newer, I don't really think it's worth the upgrade for most day-to-day use applications. On top of that, Apple is committed to becoming carbon neutral by 2030, but every time they release a new generation iPhone, millions of other devices get tossed in the dump. E-waste is becoming a huge problem, and as consumers, we really have to take some responsibility and make sure that if we are upgrading, is it worth financial sense, and is it going to make our lives more productive and useful in general? Rant aside though, I think I'll probably be sticking to the iPhone 12. For most of my day-to-day needs, it's more than adequate. If I were to upgrade, I'd probably go for an iPhone 13 or 14 max, because then I get better battery life and the 120 hertz refresh rate without having to spend double or triple the price of a newer generation iPhone 16 Pro. Definitely love to know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Do you think it's worth upgrading to a iPhone 16 or 16 Pro if you're coming from something like an iPhone 12 or newer? Really interested to see what you guys have to say about that. And if you haven't done so already, please make sure you subscribe to the channel, have post notifications turned on, and like this video. We'll see you real soon in the next one. Thank you, and take care for watching.